I would really very much like to welcome all of my colleagues and friends to this particular session of Bioplastics Hype or Hope, and hope that we can have some discussion tonight about where we're headed with this process and what we can do together to prepare in a reasonable way. First of all, before we get into this, I would like to thank the organizing partners who have arranged for this event and for several others. ReImagine Beaver County, which started this whole initiative quite a couple of years ago now, the Beaver County Marcellus Awareness Community, the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, the Climate Reality Project, and the Breathe Project, and of course, our deep gratitude to Mark for his expertise in pulling this all together so we can all see it. I would encourage you to please put your questions in the chat. We are going to have a short introduction, and then you will hear from Dr. Clifford Lau about some bioplastics basics, and then Annie Rouse, who will talk about the multiple uses of hemp. There are a number of people in this area who are interested in hemp as a replacement for plastic fuel. And Dr. Taylor Weiss, who is going to talk about an algal perspective on bioplastic, and I'll introduce them more fully. So do put your questions in the chat, and I look forward to having your inquiries join our conversation shortly. I wanted to remind us why we are looking at bioplastic, because most of the plastic that we use now comes from fossil sources, and it ends up in landfill or discarded in places where it is an accumulation of pollution in the biosphere. Very, very little gets recycled and reused. There is some plastic which remains in use after it's been created. It's still in use. These are mostly in structural materials. And understand that everything that is biodegradable is not all recyclable. Some of it is compostable in a relatively short time. Some of it will degrade in a longer period of time, years perhaps, and sometimes with industrial facilities required. Recycling means that something would be turned into another product and can usually be a lower quality product. Both bio products and fossil products can be recycled, but they're not all. All biodegradable materials are broken down by biological actions. And we're looking at moving from this linear economy that goes from raw material through an extraction process, manufacture, consumption, and then landfill to create an economy that goes more from taking minimal raw materials from the ground, manufacturing, using, and then designing to be reused, repaired, or recycled again, so that we get away from having so much accumulate as a waste product of our economy. So we're going to explore this concept a little more fully this evening and talk about some of the elements that make it possible to move into a circular mode away from our linear path of the past. So I would like to introduce now Dr. Clifford Lau. He is an industrial chemist for around 30 years. He has a doctorate from Ohio State University in synthetic organic chemistry. He's worked at Polaroid and Bayer Material Science. He taught chemistry and environmental science at a number of universities in our area, and he was on the planning committee for this group. So Dr. Lau, you have the floor, and we look forward to hearing your remarks about bioplastic basics.
Good evening, everybody. Talk to you tonight about bioplastics. So the future of bioplastics intro. Thank you very much, Dr. DeMarco, for that nice introduction. We have a very short period of time. We're going to go through a lot. We'll review plastics. We'll go over the terms and definitions. We'll discuss the philosophy of bioplastics. I know all of you are not ready for any kind of chemistry class, so we'll kind of skip over that. And then we'll focus on how Southwestern PA can participate in the bioplastics. So I'd like to call this my Cliff Note version. How many of you saw the movie The Graduate in 1967. And you can remember that one word, plastics. There's a great future in plastics. Well, it turned out there is a great future in plastics. We've made over 9 billion tons of plastic since 1950, and only 9% of it is recycled, as Patty mentioned, and it takes hundreds of years for it to degrade. So some of the plastic terms we need to know is a plastic is a polymer that can be molded and shaped. A polymer is a high-weight material made out of small repeating units. All plastics are polymers, but not all polymers are plastics. Nature has many examples of polymers, and they can be used as bioplastics. I have some of them listed there that you can read. Bioplastic is a polymer constructed from the renewable materials listed above. A bio-based plastic is a polymer that contains units derived from nature. Let's take an example for all those terms I just threw around. We have a hydrocarbon-based, fossil fuel-based polyethylene, the ethylene monomer unit being repeated, and we have a polymer, cellulose, which you're all familiar with. And you'll notice one big difference. The hydrocarbon one is based on just carbon-hydrogen bonds, and the natural one has a lot of different types of bonds. Have you ever wondered why saturated fats are not good for you? Is because your body has a very hard time metabolizing such a nonpolar material as like polyethylene. We have ways of degrading bioplastics. We have compostable and biodegradable. One other one I'd like to add from what we talked about at the beginning is Oxo Biodegradable. That one is where materials are added. This is an example of a polypropylene bag, and it's added that it breaks apart into little pieces. So it really doesn't degrade down to its basic component. It just gets so small you can't see it. And one has to remember that whether it's biodegradable or compostable, there are certain conditions you need to have in order for that to happen. Here's what I call the alphabet soup. We're not going to go through what all these different abbreviations mean, but basically you've got your bioplastics up here that are biodegradable and bioplastics. You have your bio-based plastics down here. You have your regular hydrocarbon plastics, and then you have your biodegradable, oxy-degradable ones there. We need to have a limited amount of resources on this planet Earth, and Mother Nature has been able to cycle all the raw materials so that we can maintain them. We need to do the same. We need to have cradle to grave, and you can see that on the bioplastic side, we break things down to their basic components, feed it back into the cycle, where the petrol-based side has this gap, and recycling really, as we know, is basically broken. When we consider this, we must have extended producer responsibility, and we must look at the life cycle of the analysis, and we have to consider effects on the environment and also human health, and we must apply the 12 principles of green chemistry to get this to work. And even all of this, bioplastics are a good substitute for regular plastics, but to make this really work, we need to decrease our dependence on plastic material. So I like to use the 5 R's: refuse, reduce, reuse, rot, and if all else fails, then recycle. So we have that. One of the things that can be used here in Pennsylvania is hemp being grown for CBD oil, which Annie will talk about, all the different things you can use for it. Actually, bioplastics is nothing new. Ford actually made a car out of hemp and used the hemp oil to propel the car. And currently in Europe, they do have a car based on hemp biocomposites. Another material that we grow here or have a lot in southwestern Pennsylvania is mushrooms. And mushrooms are one of the largest living structures, the mycelium. And in our next episode or on March 25th, we'll have a speaker from Ecovative that will talk about how using mushroom mycelium to use as a replacement for polystyrene. So to wrap things up, as researchers around the world work to develop greener varieties and more efficient production processes, bioplastics do hold promise to help lessen the plastic pollution and reduce our carbon footprint. So here's all the things, a nice word cloud that summarizes everything we've gone through here quickly. And hopefully in the graduate of 2021, you'll say one word, bioplastics. And one thing I've gone through quickly, I would recommend, there's this Think Bioplastic. It's an 8-episode series of videos that explains bioplastics to a much greater detail. So I appreciate your time, and I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. DeMarco.
Thank you so much, Cliff. I appreciate it. If you could stop sharing, that would be great. Okay, I am going to now turn the microphone over to Annie Rouse. She has received a U.S. Fulbright scholarship to study the environmental impact of hemp's fiber markets, and she holds a master's degree in international environmental policy as well as an MBA. She's a dedicated hemp entrepreneur, educator, and activist, and he has spent the last 10 years building a sustainable supply chain for hemp. And I would like to give her the floor now. If you would please welcome Annie Rouse to our podium. Annie, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, Patty. My name is Annie Rouse, and I'm here today to discuss hemp and the bioeconomy. So in today's world, when we think about the bio-based economy, we think about it as a new concept. Yet actually, its roots were established long before with Henry Ford, George Washington Carver, and other scientists who envisioned the chemurgic movement, or chemical manufacturing. So the idea was to use agricultural waste products, which were abundant throughout the 1930s, and repurpose them for industrial purposes like car parts, plastics, rayon, explosives, resins, and fuel. And Henry Ford and a group of these chemurgists set out to make this happen by repurposing waste materials like corn husks and turning them into automotive components. Ford's obsession mostly laid in using the soybean to create industrial products like the car seen in the left of this slide, this car is often misreferenced actually as the hemp car. And although he did use hemp in some of the car, the primary agricultural input was soy. However, almost anything that soy can do, hemp can do just as well, if not better. So there are 3 markets for hemp. Most of us think now of cannabinoids, but there's also fiber and grain. Cannabinoids are the most popular market for medicines, supplements, and the food and beverage space, depending on how regulations shake out. The grain sector also has a high opportunity for food and animal feed because of its high content of proteins, omegas, micronutrients, and macronutrients. So it's a great plant-based superfood. Now, both of these outputs have well-established supply chains, but grain also has a less established supply chain, likely due to the high prices for hemp seed oil. And it can be used, but this oil can be used for industrial applications. For instance, historically, hemp seed oil was actually used as a drying agent in paints. And future uses could include making polymers for bioplastics. And certainly not least from these 3 markets, and one day will likely be the most abundant, is the hemp fiber market. So for which the hurd, which can be seen in the bottom left center photo, it's the mulch-like material, as well as the bast fiber, which is in the bottom right corner, have vast market potential. Though currently this sector is the least established supply chain due to market supply and demand and a lack of decortication facilities in the United States. But the most important reality when it comes to bringing hemp into the new bioeconomy is that hemp is only as sustainable as what we make it. Just like every plant, hemp requires water and fertilizer to grow, and in some instances, pesticides and herbicides. Hemp also loves nitrogen, and it needs it to survive. And this is very important because while people think plants like hemp are absorbing CO2, which they are, when using industrial fertilizers for nitrogen, these nitrogen inputs create nitrous oxide, which is 300 times the global warming impact as carbon dioxide on a per unit basis, meaning it's significantly more damaging to climate change, but also controlling it means that we can have a really big impact. And one way of controlling these emissions is by using organic and regenerative agricultural practices, which will help reduce our impact. So with hemp, we have a rare opportunity to build a sustainable supply chain from the roots, literally the roots up. And it's just the beginning. So let's do it the right way. Now, when considering how hemp fits into the bioeconomy, there are two major ways to use it. The least path of resistance for hemp to enter into this market is through biocomposites, which they're cellulose derived and they use the fiber. So there is actually an immediate need for hemp fiber in the biocomposite market, and where you would use something like the hurd of the fiber, and it can be used as a filler within plastics like dashboards and cars, like the photo on the left. Now, this has a good cost-benefit relationship. And there is also a market, though, for the long-bast fiber in these kinds of biocomposites, but it has a strict competition with imported fibers like kanaf or jute. Now, you can also use the oil from the seed of hemp to create biopolymers, which could replace petroleum-based plastics. And this market exists today as well, but not for hemp seed oil, rather soybean oil, like the compostable ware, as can be seen in the photo on the right. So if hemp seed oil pricing was competitive to something like soybean oil, we could supplement some of the soybean oil in these products with hemp seed oil. But obviously, the big whale in the room of plastics is the petroleum polymer industry. And in order to compete with the petroleum polymer plastic industry, hemp seed oil prices will need to meet those of at least corn and soybean oil. And as a whole, these three kinds of bioplastics need to be no more than 10 to 15% premium over petroleum-based plastics in terms of costs. This means that in order to bring hemp into the market, we would have to increase production capabilities that will commoditize the hemp plant, pushing prices down to the equal value of corn or soy, which those two are currently priced so low they don't even cover the cost of production without government subsidies. So while we all see the environmental burden of petroleum plastics, corn and soybeans also have massive environmental issues that are contributing to global degradation, like nitrous oxide, the nitrous oxide issues that I previously mentioned. So while these are concerns with hemp, we do have a rare opportunity in front of us to introduce a new crop to the farming community. So as we do this, we must move forward in a manner that also introduces a new mindset. One that uses agricultural methods to absorb carbon dioxide into the soil, like regenerative agriculture practices, as opposed to practices that expel additional carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, like business as usual. So with healthy soils, we can reimagine our climate problem using soils as a carbon sink, while also reducing our demand on petroleum plastics by pivoting to agricultural-based plastics that, if made and disposed of correctly, could be used to improve the impact on our planet. Thank you very much. And you can find out more information by visiting my website at thinkhempythoughts.com.
Thank you so much, Annie. That is really wonderful. Very interesting and very informative. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions already in the chat. So if you could stop sharing your screen, and I will introduce Tyler Weiss. So we are going to hear from Dr. Tyler Weiss. He is an assistant professor in the Environmental and Resource Management program at Arizona State University. He's a member of the Polytechnic School and the Arizona Center for Algae Technology and Innovation. He's passionate about the development of the ASU's Algae Food Energy Water Nexus, and he has formed many interdisciplinary projects which further renewable bioproduct innovation, promote sustainable agriculture, and benefit human health. Dr. Taylor, Dr. Weiss, you are in charge of the screen now, and please give your attention to Dr. Weiss. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. So very quickly here, I'm just throwing up my contact information if anyone would like to reach out for many other things. And as was mentioned, my background is in biochemistry, but I really work with engineers, environmental and resource management, and in particular on algae. The world in which we live in now is decisions made at a molecular scale have global outcomes. And the new generation of scientists, and what I'm largely here to talk to you about today, is the far-flung future and the things that are still in development that are needed, in particular for global level solutions and large-scale sustainability. So not just small choices, but small choices that lead to large outcomes. I do this work incidentally out of the Arizona Center for Algal Technology and Innovation. We're a fairly well-kept secret in the United States, but we're known globally. We are the world's largest academic testbed facility for algae. Besides our laboratory space, we have about 4.5 acres of outdoor growth ponds as well. And so we specifically focus on future solutions at very large scales. I will mention also, we are open to public for tours. People come all the way from Maine and Massachusetts to tour with us, not during COVID, but you'd be welcome to come out anytime in the future. So where do we start with plastics and algae? So first, on the environmental side, most people probably know that plastics in the water or in the ocean are a problem because they can interfere with animals. And in particular, they're ingested. And once they're ingested, they can harm fish and sea life, other things of that nature. What you probably know less about is as those plastic particles break down, they just get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. The problem here is that as those particles get smaller, they can affect smaller predators within a natural ecosystem, things like water fleas, but they eventually reach a microscopic scale where they can be small enough that phagocytotic phytoplankton, that is algae, which actually are not photosynthetic or are only partially photosynthetic, they actually eat other cells for their food. And the problem is when they ingest a microplastic particle, they essentially can't digest it. And the result of that, they die. That particle is released, and another algae tries to ingest it and dies, and on and on. Plastics, as they degrade and are building up as microplastics in our ecosystems, are slowly degrading the basis of the aquatic food chain. And that is a very long-term concern. So we're looking at as we have to come up with a solution, and in this regard, algae can be one of those solutions. So we're talking largely about circularizing the economy and the role of biorefineries in that. So we operate in what's called the food, energy, water nexus, the overlap of these three main systems and how it applies to security. Roughly speaking, when you look at, for example, demands for irrigation has an effect on water systems, but can also affect food. If you're going to grow hemp, where's the water coming from? How is it going to be utilized? Is that going to displace food production, for example? Where's the energy coming from? Is that energy coming from a solar panel, or is it coming from a coal power plant, for example, right? The decisions you make as an individual are still tied into a larger system. That's why we call it systems engineering. In the future, security really comes from a circular economy transformation. That is, as the climate changes, as winters become more unpredictable, rains become heavier, anything of that nature, but also national security when it comes to, say, fuel production. If we want to import fewer fuels from other countries, we need to produce more energy ourselves, become more energy independent. And so a large part of the circular economy is trying to draw on more resources that we have within the United States more effectively and trying to combat destabilization and insecurity. What role is important in that is the role of biorefineries. Biorefineries are points of integration that essentially exchange resources within a circular economy, transforming different types of energy or water or food depending upon their format and at regional levels. So how one operates in California would not be the same as how one would likely operate in Pennsylvania. You're drawing upon local factors. What role algae have in the Nexus is pretty straightforward. We often term this additive or additive agriculture, for instance, right? We're not trying to compete with existing agriculture, we're trying to make more agriculture. And we're going to do it utilizing wastes and marginal resources to make these products. So for example, taking flue gases from industrial energy plants, taking wastewater from a treatment plant, those are two sources we essentially already pay just to make sure they don't pollute if we do it all. And then using sunlight, if it's available in the region, but we don't have to do it with fresh water. We can use brackish water. We can use seawater even to grow these algae. And therefore, we don't have to take more arable land for these products. And we largely are trying to therefore generate basically more agricultural products without having to displace food production. And this can certainly feed into things like biofuels, which goes on to feed transportation, but it can also be animal feed, not just terrestrial cows and things of that. Shouldn't surprise you, aquaculture, fish. Fish raised on algae tend to do better because it's closer to natural food than feeding them soybeans. That shouldn't really surprise anyone, but we need to make more algae, okay? In the bigger picture, there's also a split I want to point out, which is that biorefineries make marketed bioproducts, whereas carbon foundries, which is new terminology around this area, make feedstocks for other bioindustries. So for example, with algae, if you were collecting CO2 from a power plant and collecting wastewater from a wastewater treatment plant and then growing algae, that algae could be harvested into a biomass. And then that biomass, it doesn't necessarily become food on your plate. But what it could be is food on the plate of something you eat, or it becomes food for microorganisms, other bacteria that make the other bioproducts in your life, like medicine or bioplastics, or as it was pointed out, you'll be having mycelium packaging. They still need to feed that fungi something to grow into the packaging. So a carbon foundry is taking diverse types of carbon and consolidating it into basically carbon forms that are desirable, much like an iron foundry or a steel foundry would do. A biorefinery is actually making select individual products. So every place is able to diversify its portfolio of what it is making. It could be biodiesel, that could be edible oils, vitamin supplements, food supplements. In the particular context of today's conversation, what I'll point out is under the bioethanol, biohydrogen, bioplastic, and biofertilizer role. Algae are pretty good at making bioplastics, depending upon the variety. But the other major role, especially the intersection today I want to point out for hemp, is the most significant source of organic fertilizer that's been very stimulatory for hemp in algae, because it is natural, it's organic, and it brings a lot of things that hemp plants need. So there is some intersection of these fields. Also want to point out, just kind of in wrapping up, people often ask me, how can I help? You know, what's an easy way to go? I would start by suggesting replacing fiction with reality, right? The possibility of recycling all products is one thing, but actually knowing that in reality, how is that practiced, is often lacking. The United Kingdom, in particular, has come up with this system of on-pack recycling labels. They come a lot of different ways, but they actually have to indicate not just, is it chemically possible to recycle a product, it's, is it actually recycled basically within your region? And so consumers can make decisions on, am I buying something that will actually be reutilized or not? And that can educate customers in a lot of ways. I point this out as well because much more limited, but these initiatives are just starting in the United States, and it usually comes from grassroots sort of interaction, and people can ask for this. And this sort of work can really help bolster demand for biomaterials within their region. So with that, thank you very much, and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much, Tyler. I really appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience did as well. I would like to have all of our speakers please put your video on so people can see you, and we're going to have some questions that we've received. Please do put your questions in the chat, and I know we've had some people answering questions in the chat, but I would like to have some that we can have as a common discussion. One, first of all, was a question about what are the limits on recycling plastics, and how is recycling different from upcycling? I don't know, Cliff, if you'd like to take that one.
Yeah, I would say all plastics can be recycled. In fact, when I worked in industry, in the production, they would take the molding scrap and put it right back in again. The trouble with recycling is it gets mixed, it's sorted, and therefore it gets contaminated. Unless you have a nice, clean supply of something, it gets very hard to try to recycle it. Also, plastic for, depending on how you do it and how you heat it, a lot of times the polymer properties degrade, and therefore you can use it for something slightly less, like making plastic wood or pens or something out of it instead of what it was used for before. So there is a limit to, some people try to say, well, you just keep, passing it through, but no, it degrades. We used to take material and put 10%, 15% back in again, but you can look at that and say, well, if you got this big amount, if you only put 15% in, the math doesn't work out. You get behind the 8 ball real quick. So recycling, that's why I have it at my end of my 5 R's.
Because it isn't really a productive process, because recollecting the material isn't very effective either. Oh, excellent. Annie, do either of you want to respond to that as well, or add anything to that? Are you okay with that answer? You okay? Okay.
Yeah, great answer.
Okay, Annie, I have a question for you about what does, when hemp decomposes, does it contribute to methane production, or does it create another kind of emissions already when you decompose it? Does it create methane when it decomposes?
That is a good question. I'm not a chemist, but so maybe somebody else would know the answer. But I mean, whatever traditionally plants emit as they're decomposing would be the same thing that hemp would. It is a carbon-based plant, but that decomposition can create good compost, which can be then used to fertilize the soil. So it's a good full circle.
The short answer is it can. So it's a difference between aerobic and anaerobic. So if it's exposed to the atmosphere and there's oxygen, it'll degrade into CO2 by aerobic bacteria. But if it's buried and there is insufficient oxygen, then that carbon will ultimately typically become methane. So when people talk about being afraid to throw out basically organic biomass at your landfill, for instance, landfills don't actually want your biomass. It should be going to a wastewater treatment plant, for the simple reason that if it ends up an organic trapped in a landfill with no oxygen, it'll degrade into methane. And then those landfills actually try to flare that gas. They burn it, trying to at least combust it back into CO2 before it escapes. They can't get it all. So when you're talking about a bioplastic that can degrade in the environment, it depends where it is in the environment. But certainly within a landfill, it could be worse. So we're back to the sorting problem. The more diverse plastics we have, what to best do with each plastic becomes more difficult to actually do in practice.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you some more, Dr. Weiss, about the circularity and planning for things not to go into landfill. And one of the things that I find fascinating about the food, energy, water nexus is that you can plan for waste endpoints to become anaerobically digested so that you have biogas as a byproduct, instead of in an amorphous mess in the landfill, that you actually do it into a way that you can recapture that as non-fossil gas that can replace current methane uses. Could you speak to that a bit?
So it's interesting. So for context, Arizona State University has been considered #1 in innovation for several years now. And that's partly because all new hires, this is the home of what's called outcome-based research. Every researching professor is responsible for seeing that their work is carried forward. It's not, I made a great thing and someone else's responsibility to make it happen in the world. No, it's mine. But what it also means is I'm teaching chemical engineers who are responsible for making a plastic to now think about how am I going to reuse it?
Exactly.
And that is a big mindset change. So this is the change that is coming.
Exactly.
But then when it comes to plastics, there's also a huge split. There's a schism in this field. And the two sides essentially represent things that are easy to build and break down, meaning you have to recircularize them, but can easily transform them into other things. That is, if they escape out to the environment, they would also degrade and be less concerning. But you would really find value in recapturing it, because every time you lose it, you lose feedstock. You lose something of value to you. Okay. But then there is the hard chemist route, who people essentially want to make more resistant plastics. If they are even more resistant, if they never basically break down and degrade, they could be ultimately infinitely recyclable. But if those escape into the environment, the reason why they usually don't break down is that if they break down at all, like if an organism tries to chew on them, they're toxic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there's kind of this problem. And to set everyone's expectations, understand that in the United States, about 98 to 99% of all of our plastics are captured and are sent to landfills and are properly disposed of. Okay? But the fraction that escapes does come from coastal states, and it tends to go out in the water. And the bigger problem is, at least until more recently, we shipped out a huge fraction of plastics that we assumed were recycled to other countries, and those countries don't have developed waste systems. So if they have a recapture rate of 40%, we have this problem of the waste we generate is still escaping in the environment because there aren't the systems in place.
Yeah.
So there's this intersection of you don't want to plan for failure, but you have to look at the globe and the reality of where your plastics go in a global economy. How do they actually end up?
Yeah, I would comment that landfills are not a viable option really, unless we start mining the landfills and get the material back again. It is sort of a dead end.
Yep. Well, that is definitely, we can have a whole evening on just recycling and its failures and how we fix it. But I think the key point that I take from what you've been saying is we have to begin designing things to not end up in the landfill and change the mindset that you design your purchase patterns, your use patterns, so that you don't plan to throw things away that don't decompose into things that can be regenerated into the cycle again. So I wanted to give Annie a chance to talk about some questions that had to do with hemp versus soy as a source of bioplastic and the regenerative agriculture aspects of each of those.
Yeah. So, I mean, in general, with hemp, at this stage in the game, it's very different than soy, because soy has had 90 years to develop into the agricultural crop that it is today. And hemp, was blocked in 1937 from ever really expanding in a commercial and industrial scale that we know of for corn and in the manner of corn and soy. In terms of regenerative agriculture practices, hemp it's just like any other crop. There are differences about it. For instance, it does love nitrogen. So that's very different than soy, because soy fixes nitrogen, meaning it puts nitrogen back into the ground. But hemp in general is a really good rotational crop. So if you're using rotation as part of your regenerative agriculture practices, as you would, then it's a really good plant to follow after soy, or before soy. And it kind of just depends on how you want the nitrogen to flow. You can also use cover crops in the wintertime that fix the soil. So if you're getting ready to plant hemp in the spring, you can use a white moss, I think a farmer in Kentucky uses to fix the nitrogen in the soil and prepare it for the next season. And and then of course, reducing pesticide loads. There's hemp fiber has a lot easier time against, you need less nitrogen in it. You only need about half that of grain. And then you don't normally it doesn't have as big of a problem with weeds as the growing for cannabinoids and growing for grain. And pests are also not as much of an issue, especially when compared to cannabinoids. So depending on what market you're growing for and what other crops you are using, it can be a perfect plant to pull into your rotations.
Mm-hmm. And there's one more question about that is there has been an initiative, I think in the Appalachia region especially, to take tobacco farming areas that are in decline and using hemp as a crop in those areas, and also in areas that are being reclaimed from abandoned mine sites because it has a less demand and growth. Have you seen any advance in that kind of use of hemp in your work?
Yeah, there were some individuals that tried to do an abandoned mine site early on in like 2015 in Kentucky. It was quite difficult because animals got into it and it wasn't really, the soils weren't that great. It also, there was a big storm that came early on and it wiped the crop out. So there were a lot of problems with it. It does have a really good manner in which it can remediate soils. Mm-hmm. So it can help pull, it really loves arsenic. It also can pull a lot of lead out of the soils. It was used in Chernobyl to help remediate some of the soils there. So it is a bioaccumulator and can help kind of brownfield sites and things like that. So there are good opportunities with it there. And, just economically, I would just caution people that are getting into the cannabinoid side because the market is significantly oversupplied right now. Mm-hmm. But there is significant opportunity for especially the grain market, particularly if you have organic land. And, the fiber market, it's going to be the last to develop, but it will likely be the biggest. So there's lots of cool opportunities coming up in that space that are really just kind of scratching the surface in the infantry of the industry.
Thank you. I have a question for Cliff as well about biosourced plastics can be used to make conventional kinds of plastics like PET, and some kinds of plastics that are biosourced are not biodegradable as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can make almost any one of the normal hydrocarbon plastics. One of the components of that monomer unit may be made from a biosource. The simplest one to explain is you can take ethanol, which you can make from plants, and do a deoxygenation on it, and you end up with ethylene, and then make the polyethylene for that. So that would be a bio base, but then you still have the same chemical bonds of hydrogens and carbons. So yes, you made it from a renewable source, but the thing is not going to degrade. Right. So that's where
Right. So just because it's bio-based doesn't mean that it's going to be biodegradable. It depends on what you make with it. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
It's all in the bonds.
Yeah. I wanted to ask Taylor again, if you could talk a little bit about the water requirements for making algal plastics or bioplastic from algae. Do you have a water source issue with that as a production process?
It depends on how you make it, but not really. So again, when we're thinking nationally, Department of Energy funds our facility in particular for biofuels. And essentially, we do not want to use fresh water. We want to use marginal water. That is water which is briny, usually. It's too salty for agriculture. That's usually at least 25% that of seawater. And there's actually a lot of that. And that water is currently used in fracking. It's used in mining industry a lot. And on the other side, if you are near the shoreline, obviously seawater is a very freely available source, right? So we're always dealing with, we don't want to use fresh water as much as possible, give or take evaporation that we have to make up for, that sort of a thing. That being said, increasing the sustainability of the system, if you're talking about using wastewater, so wastewater is essentially fresh water, it's just full of nutrients. But in that case, we're actually cleaning the water. And so not only are we doing basically transformation of nutrients into new products. That's upcycling, right, a waste. But we're also providing a service. And to put this in context for everyone, right now, every single person on this call, you pay for sewer disposal. You pay your local government a fee to take your waste away all the time. Cities like Salt Lake City and much more recently Orlando, they have made an effort. They want to become the first places in the world that don't charge you for sewer disposal. They actually pay you a dividend, because what you're flushing down the drain is feedstock for them to feed algae, to turn into products like bioplastics. This is a small government solution to how do we pay for this service and make it better, right? So that water may be fresh, and then it just becomes a question of how is it being discharged, or how is it being reutilized, or anything along those lines. And the biggest question is whether your system's open or closed. If it's a big open pond in Arizona, we're going to evaporate a lot of water. We need to get rid of that heat, and water is actually a cheap way to do that. But if we completely close the system and we basically run the algae in tubes of glass and things like that, we actually have less than 1% water loss in those systems. The only water we lose is the water stuck inside the cells when we get done capturing the algae. So water use can come in a lot of different forms.
And is algal production of bioplastic an economic enterprise at this point? Do you have a production system that is cost efficient at this point?
Yeah, so there's actually a number of small startups in the United States, in Europe. I will say many of them keep getting acquired by the Chinese, so it depends on where they've been moving. But you also have to see, when we talk about bioplastics, you have to have a much broader vision beyond just the polymers themselves. So what algae have been used for a long time have been things like fillers. Fillers meaning you take a conventional plastic and you fill it with some algae because you can essentially tolerate it, but it provides food that helps that plastic break down faster in the natural environment. But where the system is now moved is algae are essentially providing, in particular, they're providing unsaturated oils and they're providing protein. These are things we used to get out of, say, soybean, but now we can get them out of algae, which is a non-food-based source, which is important. And basically the nitrogen, the unsaturated bonds, that's what allows for new covalent linkages. And that's what allows us to make new polymers that are able to be broken down or recycled and enter the environment. And then the other nifty trick, which is coming online, those same companies that were once sort of advertising what was really an algal filler bioplastic, they're now actually going through the process of making polyurethanes. These are actually using the algae to convert it chemically into plastic. So it's a real mushy region of definitions and how do you sort through all that. But yes, there are algal plastics on the market, depending upon where you're looking.
Thank you. Annie, we have some questions about your work in your company of overcoming the objections and the resistance to using hemp. Could you talk a little bit about OP Innovates and a little bit about how that has worked for you and a little bit about what your company does?
Yeah, sure. So OP Innovates is a manufacturing entity and based in Lexington, Kentucky, but our facility is in Mount Vernon, Kentucky. And we, I guess what you would call finish or we make finished products within the cannabinoid space. And so we don't farm it, we don't extract it, but we work directly with partners within that space and formulate and formulate the products, put them into bottles, and either manufacture them for others or manufacture them for our own brands. We've developed 2 different brands under our belts. One is called Hemp Mellow, which is a really nice product for stress relief. And the other brand is Overcome. And that was actually formulated for me, really, because I was bit by a tick in 2013, was diagnosed with Lyme disease in 2015, and worked with different cannabinoids to help overcome the challenges that were presented to me from unfortunately getting bit by the tick. And so we manufacture both of those brands. And then I also have an e-commerce site called Anavi Market, and we vet and verify different brands in the market and have a customer service line so that people can call in and learn about it. We also just launched our own brand as well called Anavi Relief. And we also launched a 70% hemp protein. So again, the grain market is such a unique market. It's it's really, there's a lot of innovation happening in it right now. And one of the products that we just launched is one of those innovative products. So instead of using the seed for the protein, we actually use the hemp heart. So it removes the fiber aspect and like the really earthy, gritty, grainy part of hemp seed that doesn't make it very palatable. And we just use the heart. So it is increased amount of protein and is really, it's light, fluffy, and is really kind of more like a baking flour, but not the same properties, but in that texture, and it has no flavor. So it's very exciting for us, exciting for the industry. And just in general, I mean, the industry presents a lot of challenges because it is still, while it's legal, there's still a lot of regulations to it. Insurance is hard to get. Banking is annoying. There's still a lot of hurdles that the industry is going to have to overcome. And it will come with due time, but every time that new science comes out or a new cannabinoid hits the market, like the whole Delta 8 market craze that's happening right now, it kind of puts a hold on regulators, and they're like, "Oh my God, wait, what? This gets you intoxicated? No, does it? We don't know." And so there's kind of always this regulatory scramble, and it's a new market, so it's risky. So people have, being an entrepreneur and starting a business is already pretty challenging, but doing it in like a fast moving, rapidly changing market, it makes it, and one that's, doesn't have all of the benefits of other markets, like banking and marketing on Facebook, definitely creates challenges in the market. So there's a common saying within the industry of hemp ain't easy, and that is absolutely true.
Amazing. So it raises an issue because one of the things we're looking at is ways to make biological materials a replacement for plastic in ways that can then allow them to be circular in their treatment rather than become dead ends. And what kinds of bioplastic technology is entering into the construction field for construction and building and housing materials? Are any of the things that we've been talking about today viable as building materials or building and housing?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All of you are that good.
Yeah, there is a product. I actually have a little panel that I'm having my boyfriend grab for me, but it's hemp wood. And what they do is, will you grab me that hemp wood? What they do is they take the bast fiber from the field. They don't even decorticate it or anything, and they make boards there. So like it's a flooring. It's similar to plywood. Yeah. It's a little bit closer to like bamboo flooring, but they're making tables out of it now. They're making, obviously flooring. You can do cabinetry with it. The company is called Hemp Wood. They're located in Kentucky. And so that's a perfect application. So as long as they're using, I don't know what polymers they're using or resins to really glue everything together, but, if they're bio-based, then that provides an opportunity for something to still be stable in a sense, but not be so damaging as, say, the concrete market. Where, the hempcrete market, a lot of people compare hempcrete and concrete. There is, it's a very challenging market because, and it's great because really it replaces sand to some degree, but hempcrete and concrete don't have the same structural integrity. So hempcrete has a lot more of a flexural integrity, and concrete has a lot more compression strength. And so they're not really comparative, but you can make a hempcrete house with a timber frame. It's just really a pain in the butt to do. It's kind of like if anybody's built a hay bale house, you build one once and you're like, well, I'm never going to do that again. And so there needs to be, if that technology really wants to be commercially viable, there needs to be some kind of a spray drying agent or something, kind of like one of those foam ones where you just spray it into the walls. But then there's also, You can use that bast fiber as well as like a matting for insulation, so it could replace fiberglass. That can be a tremendous impact in terms of just standard building material that can reduce our demand on some of these petrochemicals. And then there's tons of other options. Hemp can be used as graphene. People are now like creating carbonized hemp fibers and talking about like wearable tech. I mean, there's so much innovation to be made in this space that it creates a massive opportunity. And it's really, it's not the same in those senses as corn and soy. It's really more like jute, or jute is really its best kind of comparison, jute or canaf. And then there's also automotive components. So, Ford has a Ford Escape uses canaf within the door modules. It connects the interior and exterior panels. You can use those. You could replace those with the canaf with hemp, and that can be a direct line. It reduces the weight of the car. So lots of ways it can be incorporated.
Excellent. Okay. I have had a couple of people inquiring about the fact that there are a lot of materials in plastics that are not plastic themselves, but are plasticizers or flame retardants or various kinds of additives, sometimes as much as 50% of the weight of the product. Are these things replaceable by biosourced materials as well? And how do we go about looking at those kinds of changes?
I looked at that question. That's where I said we need to include looking at the life cycle analysis, but also green chemistry. That a lot of those additives can be either made to be less toxic, or they can be made as being eco-friendly in the first place. So, and I would imagine that some of them could be made from other simpler bio starting materials that would make them eco-friendly too. So that's why bioplastics in itself is not a solution to end all. Right. You need to take in green chemistry and circular economy to make it really work.
Yeah, so you have to put that design criterion that you not be making toxic materials and you not be making things that aren't degradable as a design criteria at the front end. So that's a really good one. Okay, we had a number of people wanting to know about the impact of the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry on controlling the competitiveness of bioplastics and biological replacements for plastics. Taylor, do you want to have a crack at that first, and then we'll let everyone else comment about it?
Yes, subsidies impact the market. Again, it obviously has an effect on the price, right? But it's also a highly established market. And you also have to be a little aware that plastics as a fraction of all petroleum production is a fairly small sliver. Yeah. It's a growing sliver, though, as petroleum production basically retreats. But they see their future as more tied to biocommodities or just commodities like plastics. So it's a growing sector, and therefore, those subsidies are starting to underlie the plastics market more and more, and that may become more detrimental to, say, the development of bioplastics over time. That being said, there isn't actually that much more societal demand for conventional plastics at the same time. Many things are swinging in the favor of bioplastics, and not necessarily here in the United States, but certainly in other countries, more and more conventional subsidies of some form are starting up. The most common form, what is probably the most effective, I would say at this point, is actually capital. So if you have, for example, let's just say the world's largest straw manufacturer called you up, hypothetically, because they just saw a video in which a straw was pulled out of a sea turtle's nose and it's blowing up on the internet, and they don't like seeing their product in that light. The problem for them is that they have all the existing patents on biodegradable straws. They're perfectly happy to switch over. The problem is there has to be public demand for it, and then their biggest problem is the capital. They can't just bring in a new polymer and use their existing entire machinery. They have to build a brand new $100 million factory. The only help they really need would be some sort of government intervention that would give them low cost, no interest loans. So one of the major roles of government in many countries, and what could be the United States, is tax breaks for the capital to allow for the switchover. Because if petroleum materials and bioplastics are really neck and neck in a lot of ways, you need that activation energy. You need to fuel the transition, and you need to favor that. How do we actually transition over? And it becomes about capital costs and fueling that change. Otherwise, we kind of get stuck doing half measures because that's all we can do. We can't really make the leap forward. And I'll say the other aspect of that is the way it actually works right now. Many small startups start, they make a product, it's wonderful, but they fail. Then big companies who are already petroleum manufacturers buy them. And they either buy them to become their own biological wing, or they buy them simply to push them out of business. So there needs to be some greater intervention on these parts that is leading to some more balancing. And if we want to transition, a transition in these fields.
Excellent. Well, Cliff, do you want to comment on that at all in terms of what would take to get these new advancing industries over the hump? You've worked for a number of big companies. And do you have anything in your experience that you could advise on the advance of a new industry like this?
Yeah, I would say it's cost. I know one of the things is the marketing people would come to me and want me to develop this plastic with the best properties and stuff so they could sell more. And if you really look at it, the plastic that sells the most is the one that's the cheapest. But I would also say then you need regulations that if you take the example like exhaust car emissions and stuff, that when you put a cap on saying that the emissions have to be this much in 5 years, gives a driving force. So we need that same kind of regulation motivation from the government to say, okay, so much of your product needs to be green or how you'd want to define it. And that will stimulate the development. And of course, again, people's demand. And if you stop buying the stuff that isn't compostable or biodegradable, then they won't have the money to make more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I would like to ask you all to think a little bit about what are the most important parts of the regulatory infrastructure that we need to put in place to advance a circular treatment of materials, not just in the creation of them so that they're designed to be reused, but also to change the culture of care from throwing it away to making sure it's reused. What kind of regulatory infrastructure do we need to create? Because the one we have currently does not do that at all or incentivize it.
Right. So our current regulatory structure for waste is largely about if these things are going to cause hazard to the environment or cause hazard to people, we need to separate them. We need to isolate them. And that's kind of the exact opposite ethos of circularizing the economy, which is that no, it's not going to stagnate. It's going to be reintegrated into a better form, basically. Our current regulatory structure simply is not built around that at all. It's built on end of life, out of mind, out of sight kind of a thing. So that's the first part. The labels that I brought up, I think, are really important because people might recognize the recycling symbol, right? 3 kind of twisting arrows. But what they don't realize, that's not a protected symbol. It doesn't actually have any enforceable definition behind it. And so if you buy any product you see that symbol on, anybody can slap that on anything for any reason, and it doesn't actually mean a thing. That's a problem. And so connecting end of life is really important. And so just for added context, right, if people right now in my area of Phoenix, are still buying products and they're making decisions on buying this because it's recyclable or that, or it's good for the environment, what they don't know is because cities have essentially third-partied out the recycling infrastructure. During COVID, it no longer became cost-effective. Mm-hmm. So everyone who's putting their recyclable goods in every wastewater can in this area, it's just going straight to landfill now. But they don't know that. And local governments really don't like to admit those sorts of things sometimes. So labels which actually reflect and force then producers to also know what is happening to their plastics in the places that they're sending them, at least at like a state level, that sort of thing, and saying, where's this plastic actually going to end up? And then the on label, meaning different parts. So things as simple as a simple pop bottle. The bottle itself is actually highly recyclable, pretty good recovery rate. But the cap and the little extra bit at the top is not. And it's really problematic. And they actually expect you to take that off. Nobody does that. It doesn't really happen, right? It's a problem. So encouraging designers to incorporate plastics or different cap designs or things like that that make the entire unit recyclable to reflect the reality of how people dispose of it and where these things actually end up. That has to be additional motivation. If companies only see the price tag and they never see the reward of trying new designs, there's no feedback mechanism for basically better green chemistry practices as well, right? So tying those two together.
Excellent. Thank you. Anyone else have suggestions about regulatory infrastructure?
Yeah, so I would recommend everybody to tune in to the podcast Throughline. It's done by NPR, and there is a specific episode called The Litter Myth. And it is super fascinating episode all about how in the 1950s, a group of corporations created a campaign called Keep America Beautiful.
Yeah.
And it was a campaign that basically ended up changing the mindset and made consumers think that they were responsible for the waste stream of their products.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it changed completely what happened. I mean, I'm not going to ruin it for everybody, but it's super fascinating. Tune in. There's a link in the chat. But if we put the responsibility on to corporations to have to take their waste back and recycle it and upcycle it and do whatever they need, then perhaps some of those innovative solutions to changing their packaging to reduce that impact could be made. I also think that in general, we really need to be thinking about the true cost of products, because no one really thinks about the full environmental life cycle of it. And that is a big problem because the environment was never considered within our economic mindset. So when GDP or gross domestic product was created back in the 1940s, they didn't include environmental protection or any kind of aspect that would give some kind of representation to the environment. And if we don't fix that problem, then we're not going to really fix the real problem with it all, because we can't actually put a cost to the environment in the way that it currently is.
Yeah, that's been a problem with a lot of things, is that even with climate change,
Exactly.
you don't have a true cost reflected in the marketplace. So people don't get a signal that properly represents the consequences of their actions. And that goes to food consumption and all kinds of other things. Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to the subsidy conversation.
Yeah, it does.
And they often have a hard time putting a dollar value on the environment, but you can use factors like, for instance, beachfront property. How much does somebody pay for an ocean view versus the neighbor? What's the difference in the price? Well, could be the economic benefit of protecting that area.
Yeah. So just to put it another way, right? There's a cost of doing bad, which is usually disposal, but there's no advantage to doing good. That's the other way.
You have to put a value on waste.
Mm-hmm.
And one analysis I saw was a lot of countries make their dollars and money out of plastic, and you never find one of those pieces of money laying on the ground because it has value.
Yeah.
And the same thing, but people don't think anything about, throwing out a pop bottle or anything and not doing anything with it, because to them it has no value. That's why back in the good old days when you got 10 cents when you returned a Coke can or a glass bottle or something like that, you've got to give the waste a value.
Well, and that is true in states that have a bottle deposit law. Their rate of recovery of recycled bottles is about 85 to 90%, even if it's just a nickel. And there is now pending national legislation to make a national bottle bill bottle deposit bill. I'm hoping that we can at least begin with that, because that does begin to bring that out into a more public focus on the fact that things have a value and can be reused, and start to create the markets for the recovery of material, which we are really way behind. In Europe, they do much more effective recovery of material than we are right now. So I wanted to be mindful of the time. We're having a lot of questions that we haven't been able to get to, but people are beginning to raise issues about competition of land for growing materials as opposed to growing food. And what are some of the consequences of reassigning the value of things like corn crops that are currently being used to feed animals, when you can be rotating crops that are creating materials as well as foods? Do you want to comment on the relative value of food versus materials? Cotton, flax, bamboo, hemp, all of these things are agricultural products. And are we going to end up just creating more competition for food production?
I think it depends on what crop you're growing and how efficient we are at utilizing it. I mean, corn husks are if you grow corn, you're going to have the husk, but we can still do something with that husk. Mm-hmm. If we look back at Henry Ford's model, he hated waste. That's why he wanted to use every part of the farm. And that's why the Kimmerich movement really started. And so if we look at it in that respect, and things like hemp, we can dual harvest. We can harvest for the fiber, and we can harvest for the seed. Now that fiber won't be as strong, because once it starts producing seed, all the nutrients leave the fiber and go into the seed. But we can still use that fiber for the biocomposite market, or for animal bedding, or whatever it might be. You also, with hemp grain entering the animal feed market, it presents a better opportunity than, say, corn or soy, because it has a lot better protein in it. It also has a certain amino acid in it that's really good for chickens, for laying eggs. And right now we're pumping those chickens with some synthetic version of it. So why not just give it an actual hemp seed? But it has to go through all of these ridiculous regulatory processes in order to get it approved as an animal feed, even though it was approved before the FDA even existed.
Oh, dear.
So, in general, we just need to be more efficient about our production, because you go to grocery stores and there is too much food. It's not being allocated to the right people. I mean, there's like 1 in 6 people in Kentucky go hungry. But there's tons of foods on the shelves. So we need to be able to divert food and also not be so scared of imperfections in food. There's ways that you can glean the land and get that off. I mean, there's so much arable land in the United States. We're very blessed, but it's about protecting that land, making sure that we're producing on it correctly and sustainably, and that we're being efficient in those production practices. And unfortunately, things like subsidies kind of counteract that. Yep. But there's room for both, I think.
Yep. So go ahead.
I think they can be complementary, that there's a lot of things that could be used on the side. And like you say, the hemp or the forget what, the kind of grass and stuff, things that aren't used for food. That was one of the things that happened with ethanol for gasoline, was they started changing the corn over to that. Well, that didn't make much sense, but you can get ethanol from a lot of other things that aren't food-based. And one of the slides that I didn't get to show was you can actually take waste from orange peels and make clothing fiber out of them. So we can do some things like that, that a lot of the things that aren't being used for anything else can now become bioplastic feedstock.
Good. Well, we're coming down close to the end of our time together, and I wanted to ask the question that we started with: is bioplastic a hype or is it a hope? for our future in materials management. I'd like to give each of you a chance to talk about that. And I will go in reverse order and have Taylor go first. What do you think, Taylor? Is it a hype or a hope?
Call it cautiously optimistic. There's so many plastics. There's so many applications. If there's any impression you've gotten, it's this big, complicated subject. And speaking about it in definitives is hard. Well, what you have to look at in, say, even just cellulose production from algae or out of hemp or things like that, that cellulose can go into dressings and wounds in medicine. It can be used as insulators in batteries. It is in high demand by NASA to insulate materials in space. But not every farmer is going to produce a material of that high quality, right? There's going to be all these other lesser cutlery and all these other sorts of things, right? So there are enormous possibilities. Within algae, the biggest problem we have, why we focus so much on biofuels, is that there are so many potential applications. We need a single focal point to kind of unite us around. That's why we talk about biofuels so much. Not that that's its best application. That's just a commonality, right? So am I hopeful? Yes, absolutely. There will be a future of algae and hemp in bioplastics, but whether it's as a plastic, as a fiber, as a mixture, how it's used as a paper, you just really have to broaden your definition to start encompassing this. You just have to be aware that the past model of petrochemical companies making a plastic, defining what a plastic is, defining what it could be, that's what has to change through education.
Great. Annie, what do you think? Is it a hype or a hope, bioplastic?
I'm hopeful. I would say also cautiously optimistic. I mean, I think that there is huge movement into the bioplastic market. Unfortunately, I think that COVID kind of halted some of that. I mean, people were becoming very aware of single-use plastics because of the sea turtle with the straw and various other marine things that occurred, and that was really very much on the rise. And then once COVID hit, it kind of put that all backwards. I mean, because now everybody's using single-use gloves and single-use masks and single-use plastics wrapped in plastic. And that is definitely disappointing. But, I think that, yes, with that education, we can turn things around. But I think we really need a government regulatory change to force things to happen. Because otherwise, chemical companies and petroleum industries and manufacturing companies, unless you are really committed to changing the future of the environment and the world, like my company is, you're not going to make those decisions because it's all based on money. Right. And how much can you increase your margin? And until there's some sort of incentive or some sort of regulatory change, it's going to be difficult to make an impact on a wide scale.
The invisible hand of the market isn't going to do it, right?
Right.
And Cliff, what do you think? Do we have hype or hope for bioplastics?
I definitely think it's hope. And what I see in a lot of the articles, though, is that that bioplastics by themselves are going to be a savior, and they're not. And I think it's written from the people who really don't want it to work. So they say, oh, yeah, it's not the perfect end all. It's not going to solve all our problems. And that's true. It's not. It's going to be one part of the solution. And we need to develop a more comprehensive look at how we deal with all this stuff. And again, coming back to what I say about the 5 R's, we just can't keep consuming as much as we have. One thing the Americans consume 3.5 equivalents of the earth. And if the rest of the earth wants to come up to, 7 billion people or 10 billion people, we can't keep consuming that much material. So things have to change.
So I like to come back to the philosophy that we're not facing a technology problem. We're facing an ethical problem. We're facing a question of how we use the materials on the earth and how we live in harmony with the world that we're in, and not as an abuser, but as a participant in the natural cycles of the earth. And I think if we can focus on meeting our needs as lightly as we can and leaving as small of a footprint as we can on the living earth, then we're more likely to survive. So I thank you all so much for participating and for being with us this evening, and all of you out there in the ether. I would like to have you join in a round of applause for our speakers and for the wonderful organizers of this program, the ReImagine Beaver County, the Beaver County Marcellus Awareness Community, League of Women Voters, the Climate Reality Project, and the Breathe Project. And all of you out there who are working hard every day to make this world a better place. And I thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart. So we'll see you on the 25th of March. And there are a number of other times when we can get together and converse again about this subject. So with that, thank you and good night.